When we talk about US India trade tensions, most people immediately think of tariffs on goods like steel, textiles, or chemicals. That is the usual battlefield. But today, India's biggest engine of foreign exchange is not textiles or auto parts. It is services, mainly IT and IT enabled services. Last year alone, India exported close to $390 billion worth of services, of which a very large chunk came from software, consulting, and IT support. And here's the kicker: the United States accounts for more than half of this demand. In other words, when you think about Indian IT companies like TCS, Infosys, Wipro, or even the large multinational development centers of Google, Microsoft, and JP Morgan, the biggest client is America. Now, with Washington imposing steep tariffs on Indian goods and India refusing to toe the American line, it is natural to ask what happens if the US decides to move the battlefront to services? Because tariffs don't directly apply to services, the Americans would have to use other tools, and history shows they have plenty of tools. The most obvious lever is immigration. Indian IT exports don't just mean code flowing over fiber optic cables. They also mean thousands of Indian engineers flying into the US every year on H1B and L1 visas to work on site with clients. If Washington wants to squeeze Indian IT, this is the fastest way. We have seen it before. In 2010, the US Congress passed a law that slapped special surcharges on H1B and L1 visas. The language was neutral, but everyone knew that it was targeting Indian IT firms. Overnight, the cost of sending an engineer to the US shot up by thousands of dollars per person. Companies like Infosys and Wipro had to absorb these costs, cutting into margins, and India had to complain about it at the WTO. Fast forward to today, and you're already seeing signs of similar tactics. The US Immigration Agency has increased H1B registration fees and introduced more rigorous selection processes. Approval rates, which had once dropped to as low as 20% during the Trump years, could easily be throttled again. Processing delays, stricter document checks, and outright denials can all serve as silent trade barriers. All this does not just hit companies, it ripples down to Indian students who go to the US for STEM education. We've already seen reports of higher refusal rates for Indian F1 student visas, and if the trend continues, it reduces the pipeline of fresh talent feeding into the American job market through OPT and eventually H1B visas. The second lever is federal procurement. The US government is one of the world's largest buyers of IT services. Think about defense systems, Medicare databases, IRS software, or airport security IT. These are huge contracts, often running into billions of dollars. And while Indian IT firms don't directly win Pentagon contracts, they often sit at the subcontracting chain through US primes. The US can simply tighten the rules, and clauses like Buy American or cybersecurity certification requirements can force agencies to demand that sensitive work be done by the US citizens only on American soil. That effectively cuts India out of the loop. We saw shades of this during the Trump administration and when executive orders told federal agencies to limit the offshoring of work. Now, before we go ahead, make sure that you subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone you think will benefit. If you're somebody who wants to make a career in finance, my RIA and RE courses are live now and you can get details about them in the Telegram group. The link to join the Telegram group is in the description. A particularly important example here is the Department of Defense's Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification or CMMC. It sets the bar for anyone handling sensitive defense related data. The higher levels of certification practically require the work to be done inside the United States. So if Washington wants to scale this up across more federal work, it can quickly erode India's role as the offshore hub. Now the third weapon is taxation. Now this one does not sound like a trade weapon at first, but hear me out. US lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have at different times proposed surtaxes or penalties on companies that offshore work. The idea is to make it less attractive for an American company to save costs by sending its IT or customer support contracts to India. Sometimes it is framed as protecting American jobs, other times as raising revenue. If such taxes or penalties are passed again, even in a watered down form, the pressure on Indian IT could be significant. In fact, even rumors of such provisions in tax reform bills can make US companies hesitant to expand contracts with Indian vendors. Then there are data and security levers. Services trade depends on data flows, source code, customer records, health information, etc. If the US decides that certain kinds of sensitive personal data cannot be processed outside US borders, it can force banks, hospitals, and government agencies to keep more work onshore. You might recall how Europe introduced GDPR and forced companies worldwide to adapt. The US has not gone that far on privacy yet, but in areas like defense, telecom, and health data, restrictions are already tightening. In practice, these rules act like barriers to Indian firms accessing some of the most lucrative contracts. Now, we should also mention the nuclear option sanctions and entity bans. If any large Indian IT firms were accused of violating export controls, mishandling sensitive data, or even doing business with a blacklisted Russian or Iranian entity, it could theoretically be put on a restricted list. That is unlikely in the mainstream case, but it's a reminder of how the US government can target specific companies with precision if it wants to send a message. So, if America chosen to weaponize these tools, what is the scale of the impact? Let's put some numbers on it. As I mentioned earlier, India exported nearly $390 billion in services last year. Out of this, IT and IT enabled services account for about $280 billion. Roughly 60% of that business is linked to US clients, whether directly through outsourcing contracts or indirectly through global capacity centers of American multinationals in India. So that is about $140 billion exposure to US demand. Now imagine Washington introducing measures that cut just 10% of that business. So that is $14 billion hit straight away. At an average revenue per employee of about $50,000 a year, that translates to almost 300,000 jobs at risk. Double the shock to 20%, and we're talking about more than 500,000 direct jobs. Not to mention the indirect jobs in transport, food services, and real estate in IT hubs like Bangalore, Pune, and Hyderabad. The impact on good government finances is also non trivial. Companies in the sector pay corporate taxes, employees pay income taxes, and both groups spend on consumption that generates GST. A severe shock could wipe out close to $2 billion in corporate taxes and another $2 to $3 billion in personal income tax and indirect taxes. And this is not just a number story, it is about confidence. India's current account stability today rests heavily on the services surplus. Merchandise trade runs a persistent deficit, and it is software exports that make the balance of payments manageable. If growth in those exports stalls because of US policy barriers, then India's currency and macroeconomic stability could come under new pressure. Rupee could be touching 100. Of course, the US will not take these steps lightly. American companies themselves benefit massively from India's IT industry. Think of every global bank that runs its risk analytics out of Gurugram, or every tech giant with a 10,000 person campus in Hyderabad. If the US government makes it harder for these companies to operate globally at lower costs, they themselves will push back. That is why, in the past, measures like the 2010 visa surcharge or the 2020 executive orders have been temporary or limited. There is always a balancing act between protectionist policies and corporate efficiency. But in a deteriorating geopolitical climate, when Washington wants to push India into punishment for non alignment on issues like Russia, even temporary measures can sting. The path of least resistance is visas, tighten approvals, delay processing, etc., that can shave off billions from Indian IT revenues without even a formal trade war. Federal procurement is the other low hanging fruit, and over time, you could see more subtle levers like stricter cybersecurity rules, pushing commercial clients to keep more work onshore, etc. So, what does this mean for India? First, the IT industry would need to double down on diversification. Europe already accounts for a quarter of Indian IT exports, but it could grow further. The Gulf countries are emerging as big spenders in digital transformation, and India has cultural and cost advantages there. Second, companies would need to adapt delivery models. More local hiring in the US, Canada, and even Mexico may become necessary to hedge these risks. And finally, there's a policy angle. India will have to negotiate harder on digital trade agreements and mutual recognition of cybersecurity standards to keep the pipelines open. To wrap up, tariffs may dominate the headlines, but the real risk lies in services. For India, that is where the heart of the modern economy beats. If US decides to weaponize its immigration system, procurement rules or data regulations, the impact could be felt across Indian IT corridors. And while it may not wipe out the sector, even a 10 to 20% disruption would mean hundreds of thousands of livelihoods destroyed. This is a reminder of just how globally entangled the Indian economy is. It is not just trade, it's the entire economic engine of urban India. And that makes this a story to watch very closely.